So, good evening and welcome to this evening's event from the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. It's great to have you here, whether you're here in person or you're joining us online. And we understand with COVID and with everything else, the balance has shifted towards many more people being online. My name's Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. For some of you, I'm sure you know Jesus very well, or Jesus College at least. For others, this may be your first time. So we have an amazing history, originally as a 12th century nunnery, and then a college since 1496, since when many of our academics have gone on to change the world in so many different ways, from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lisa Jardine, Clean Bandit, if you follow their music, and many, many others. The aim of the Intellectual Forum is to get people to think and talk about some of the key issues that are happening at the moment as well. And one of those is to do with technology and all sorts of aspects of that. And that's the theme that we're really exploring today. And over the years, we've had some amazing speakers. We've had Siva Vaidyanathan talking about some of the problems with Facebook. We've had Sam Gilbert talking about good data and some of the benefits that you can have. And we have more still to come. We have the Twitter's Global Head of Public Policy, Nick Pickles, coming to talk a bit later, a rescheduled event because of COVID, and much more. But tonight, I'm really, really pleased to welcome, I'm not sure whether to say welcome or welcome back, because he's been with us virtually before, but not in person.
No, it doesn't count.
So it doesn't count. So welcome for the first time to Jesus, Dex Hunter-Torricke. Dex has worked for almost everybody in the entirety of the tech sector worldwide. He's written speeches and worked for Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, Schmidt. He's worked for SpaceX, for Google, and now the Facebook Oversight Board, which is a really interesting experiment in how do you hold an organization like Facebook accountable. So Dex, it's really, really wonderful to have you here. Just the format so that we both know it, but also so everyone else does, is we'll have a bit of a chat for a bit, but then we'll really take questions from the audience here and online. And if you're online, please go use the Q&A feature and I will keep track on here. So Dex, it's great to have you here and to talk about this. Could you just start off by perhaps saying a little bit about the vision for the Oversight Board? Like, why did it get set up in the first place?
Sure. So the Oversight Board was created to answer one question really well, which was, how can we make Facebook answer fewer questions on its own without Mark Zuckerberg's influence? There are lots of things that on a daily basis, Facebook is deciding that have a huge impact on our society, on the billions of users who are using Facebook's platforms. And a lot of those things are questions that we think should be decided not just by the company acting on its own. So the Oversight Board was created basically as an independent check on some of those very consequential issues about content moderation. Questions about things like hate speech, about bullying, about how do you deal with content from dangerous individuals and organizations. So for many, many years, the company has been off answering all of these things on its own, doing its work in a silo. And with the Oversight Board, there is now a set of 20 people who are independent experts and leaders around the world who are taking a closer look at some of those very challenging, sometimes very controversial issues that are playing out on the platform, and telling the company, this is how we think you should change your policies and the way you enforce them. So the board is a very interesting, grand experiment in a different approach to content moderation. There are two very interesting pieces to this work, which I'll just draw attention to. One is we are empowered to make binding decisions on the company when it comes to content. And that is something that there is no equivalent body for any other big tech platform, certainly that I'm aware of. So the board is able to pick up cases which are appealed by any user on Facebook and Instagram. If you have a piece of content that has been taken down by the company, or there's a piece of content that you think should be taken down by the company, that is something you can potentially go and appeal it to the Oversight Board. And I say potentially because there's a little bit of a process. There is an existing appeals process, of course, where you can appeal things to the company. Once you've gone through that process and if the company doesn't satisfy you, you can then take it to the Oversight Board. And over 1 million people have submitted appeals to us so far in just the last year or so since the board started accepting appeals and making decisions. The company can send over appeals as well, though we take a lot less of them than users. We want to put the focus on allowing people to make their voices heard rather than the company just sending things to us. The other piece which I'll draw attention to is the recommendations we make. So as well as the binding aspect of all of our work, which I think is very important, There's another piece which, when the board launched, received a lot less attention, but over time, I think people are recognizing this actually is probably the most interesting and impactful piece of the board's work. In every case, we're using that as an opportunity to lift up the hood on the company and to look inside and to see what are the systemic problems in their policies and the way that they're enforcing them. And we then make policy recommendations to the company. We'll tell them, you should rewrite these rules on hate speech so that they're clearer for users. You should translate these standards so that people who are using these platforms who aren't just in the United States or Western Europe can actually read what the rules are in the first place. We give them recommendations on ways to scrutinize and to expose their policies to greater scrutiny. So I think the recommendations over time have the potential to really reshape the way the company operates. And so far, we've issued over 100 recommendations. The company has agreed to more than half of those or has already implemented those. So I think we're off to a good start. But the board really, it goes back to that initial question, which was how do we get Zuckerberg out of so many of these decisions? And I think that's a pretty laudable goal.
I mean, there's so many questions that just come from what you've just said, but I'm partly struck by this issue that it seems to me underpins this and some work I used to do with DeepMind Health, looking at trust. A lot of tech, there's big issues about do you trust, should you trust technology companies? You probably know Honora Neal's work looking at trust versus trustworthiness. Do you see your work as being trying to demonstrate trustworthiness for Facebook, or do you see it in a different light?
Well, I don't think about our work in terms of us creating value for the company. Certainly I think the company has huge challenges with trust. They've got lots of people, who are focused on that challenge. We are a small entity, of course. We've got our 20 members and about 50 staff. We are focused very specifically on how can we scrutinize the rules that govern Facebook and Instagram and the way that the company is enforcing those rules. And if we can make an impact there in steering those rules and the enforcement towards treating users more fairly, I think that will down the road have a big impact on the trust of the platform. But there are so many different strands of what goes into making trust and reputation. And there's a whole bunch of other things that are not within the power of the board, right? Which go into how people perceive the company and how they think about the impact of technology on their lives and on their communities. So we have a very, very narrow role, but I think it will have an impact there, right?
And I mean, it's interesting about how you distinguish between your role and that of the company, which we may come back to, because there's a bit of a turtle problem here. Why should anybody trust you and the work that you and the board are doing? Yep. How can we be sure that you're playing a straight bat?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, absolutely, very fair question. With a company of the kind of scale and influence of Meta, I think it would be unusual if you weren't skeptical when you heard about the existence of this very novel approach to content moderation. And certainly when I came on board, I was one of the early members of the Oversight board staff. I joined back in April 2020 when we were just forming the board. I asked all of these questions, right? There's two things I would think about. One is, structurally, the board has been configured in a way that is designed to keep the company's influence out of our decisions. And I think that independence of the board is a very, very important part of why the board is successful and is set up to be successful. So Meta, of course, gave the money to set up the board. It was their original idea. And naturally, if somebody's funding your work, you think they're exercising influence over you. There's a conundrum though, right? If you wanted to create this kind of body, someone's got to set it up. Who else is going to set it up except the company? So the way this problem was solved is the Oversight board actually has 3 components. It's not just a board. It's not just 20 people off in a room somewhere. There's the staff who are part of the administration, which is again all set of independent staff who are not affiliated with the company. We work completely separately from them. There's then a set of trustees. So there's an Oversight board trust, which is where Meta puts the money into. It's an irrevocable trust. They don't get their money back if they decide they don't want to work with the board anymore. And the trustees don't have any role in the decision-making of the board. So they're there really just to manage the fiduciary responsibilities, to preserve the independence of the board, and to keep Meta away from that board and the decision-making structure that's taking place there. The board members themselves, they are all characters and leaders who, again, are very, very independent. We were chatting a little bit before about some of the members that we know. And none of these people owes their position or their success to the company. They're all doing it in a part-time capacity. They're spending a lot of time in it, but it's not their sole or full-time role. And again, that was very deliberate to prevent any member becoming dependent on the company or thinking that, we have to keep serving the company in order to retain that position for our professional trajectory. I think the other thing I would say, as well as the structure, one very simple thing, you should, trust the board based on the results. And I think that's true of any entity, right? We can talk a good game, and I think we do, and I think we've got a very clever structure. But ultimately, the value of the board is going to be determined on, can we, over the long term, make the company treat users more fairly? And if we can't over time show that we are shifting the company in the direction of doing that and having rules that are fairer and enforcement that is more principled, then I think people would reasonably be able to ask, is the board a valuable thing? And so I think that's something you have to judge over the long term. I think so far we've started to generate those results. We're 14 months into issuing decisions, so we're still pretty young as an institution. But certainly I would be looking to judge it over the results over the next few years.
And it's been likened to a Supreme Court.
It's an analogy I never use. I think this was invented by some very clever PR hack who probably worked for the company. But certainly it's not one that I ever use. And I think it's inaccurate to an extent, right? Because we're not a court, and we're not like a state-like entity. We are exactly what we set out to be, which is a board, and we provide some oversight functions.
But I mean, the normal way to check that rules are complied with is to have courts, genuine, real statewide courts. Now, obviously, there's some problems with the transnational organizations, but would you be happier, would the company be happier if there was a sort of truly independent organization that covered all the different tech companies? Is this a substitute for, completely independent regulation? Because it is still a form of self-regulation, isn't it?
Right. So, I mean, the Oversight Board, is a self-regulatory body. I think, the short answer I'd say is you'd have to ask them, right? I think it would also be difficult for them to give an answer based on hypotheticals. I don't think that they would ever conceive of any world where you don't need a strong regulatory foundation for all of this work. And, certainly from the board side, we don't take a point of view on the greater regulatory agenda. Like, we're focused on doing what we're doing. We are not out there lobbying about particular laws or ways of regulating tech. I think most of our members see our role coexisting very nicely with a lot of the regulatory moves that are underway in the UK and in the EU, which are designed to protect users and to strengthen those protections for users.
But now there must be times when there's a clash between the approach that you have and laws in different countries.
Sure.
We have legislation, as UK, EU, which try to draw balances between free speech and protections and so forth. And you might draw them in a different place.
Sure.
What do you do when there's a clash of statute law compared to the approach that you've taken?
Yeah, so actually on the question of like whether the board's decisions would potentially be incompatible with local laws, actually we have a very structured, very transparent set of bylaws. You can find them on our website. You can see literally all of the procedures that we have. One very clear rule in there is that we can't make decisions that would contravene local laws. Ultimately, the board wants its work to be recognized and to be implemented by the company, and the company has to comply with local laws wherever it operates. So we're not out there, making a point, passing things that have no chance of being implemented in particular markets. And I don't think that would be a particularly good use of time by the board. Certainly, there are times, and there have been many just in the last couple of years, where the political discourse and the inclination of policymakers is to go in a different direction than the work of the board. And they're actually the fact that I think the board is very, very principled and is trying to base its decisions in many ways on international human rights standards that actually ensures that we are not just going to be responsive to that sort of political context. We're not making decisions to be crowd-pleasing. Someone once asked me when I joined the board, are you going to try and make lots of decisions early on which are equally satisfying to everyone to try and build some credibility? And I said, no, we're going to make lots of decisions that are equally unsatisfying to everybody, because it seems that that is in fact the trajectory the board is on often, to make very principled decisions about human rights, which lots of different constituencies may actually disagree with in different ways. But I think we do it in a way that is transparent, that is clearly principled, is grounded on human rights principles. And if people disagree with that afterwards, we'll take our lumps.
So there are questions coming in online, and we'll come to questions from the audience in a bit. But Just a few other things to explore, because you said right at the beginning that you've had, I think, 1 million appeals.
That's right.
Which is a huge number. How many have you actually dealt with in any meaningful way?
So we've only decided, and I'll say only with a big caveat, because I'll explain why I think it's actually important, 22 cases. So you have 1 million appeals, all sorts of things that are being sent in by people, and you then funnel it down to a much smaller number, and then you ultimately end up with 22 case decisions. Why is that significant? Why isn't that incredibly embarrassing? We were not designed to be a general sort of customer service function for the company. With 20 people and 50 people, you can do the math. There's no way that set of people is going to deal with even a small percentage of 1 million appeals. It's just not possible. What we are trying to do is to pick up, out of that huge number of cases, the biggest possible emblematic cases which speak to real systemic problems within the company. So we're not trying to solve every single one of those problems. What we are trying to do is find out where are the rules and the enforcement of those rules, where are they deficient within Facebook and Instagram? And if we can correct those and the company goes away and implements what we're telling them to do, that over time will impact millions or billions of pieces of content from a lot more users. So that's how we think about it. Each of those cases, is producing recommendations. So the 100+ recommendations that we've given over the last year, that's actually, digging into things which potentially impact a lot of users, well more than the 22 cases. So, one example, because of things that the board has pushed through within the company, more than 400 million more people in the world can read the company's rules in their languages. You would be, your mind would be boggled to discover that in large parts of the world, actually the community standards that apply to Meta's platform were actually never even readable in local languages. The company literally never thought about that. They just said, you can have English or nothing. And for a group of people who are very focused on human rights, we said, that's ridiculous. You've got to make your rules inclusive, and they've got to be things that people can actually interpret for themselves.
How long is this going to last? You said that there was money given. Presumably that runs out at some point.
It will. We see no signs that the company is backing away from the commitment to the board. I expect there'll be additional resources for the board, in the near term. The board is configured right now initially to last 5 or 6 years. I expect we'll be around considerably longer than that. But it's an experiment, right? It is something that was designed to demonstrate its value over the next few years. I think lots of people in the outside world are looking now to see how it performs. I think we're starting to generate that kind of traction on the company. I think if the board is generating results, I think we'll be around.
So I've asked you about sort of the timeliness. We've talked about the depth and the number of appeals. What about the breadth? What is your scope? How much can they just say this isn't you?
Yep. So we definitely are not there to solve all of the problems with the company, or even, I would say, a large percentage of them, right? That's just the way the board has been designed. We have a narrow but deep scope. So there are 2 platforms within our scope, Facebook and Instagram. We don't deal with WhatsApp. We don't deal with Oculus, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that when we talk about the Metaverse and the future of content. Within Facebook and Instagram, our focus is on content that has been taken down by the company. That was our initial focus. We then expanded our scope to also include content that people wanted to see removed from the company. So when the board launched in May 2020, we initially only had one of those capabilities. We later added the other one, and that massively increased the amount of things coming into the board. There are some areas which we don't currently have within our scope, but I expect over time they may come within our scope. One is around account suspensions. So right now, if your account is just disabled by the company, you can't just appeal that to the board. Over time, we expect you will be able to, but technically that functionality needs to be built out. In the case involving former President Trump, of course, the board was asked to decide should Trump get his Facebook and Instagram account access back. The reason we could consider that is because the company referred that case to us. So it wasn't that Trump appealed that to the board. The company made the decision and then said, we want the board to make a binding decision on us and definitively answer this. So I do think account suspension, that's a big one, which certainly, the board has an appetite to get into. I think over time we will get into that. Another one is advertising, right? So right now we're not focused on advertising. It is obviously an incredibly important, area. It is something that, deserves much greater scrutiny. It's not something that's within the board's scope. You could argue that it should be, But right now, with the focus on the user content, certainly there's more than enough stuff that we've got in front of the board right now. I will say one thing that always comes up, and we might want to talk about this some more, is algorithms. So the board wasn't designed at the outset to be the oversight board for algorithms. And this is an interesting topic of conversation, because a lot of people assume that there is an algorithm. It's some sort of distinct thing somewhere where you're either in it or you're not. And actually, I think the board actually does have a big impact on algorithms and how we think about the use of automated technology within the company, because there's the sort of coding and the design and the setup of automated systems, and the board isn't involved in that. But the things that we are focused on are how those systems are then employed to focus on moderating content. So we are looking at the rules and the procedures and the enforcement around those rules. And a lot of the things that the board has looked at, then by making recommendations to the company, they might translate into upstream changes to those algorithms. If we say you need to think in a different way about this piece of hate speech, or these rules need to be tweaked to reflect that satire is a perfectly reasonable form of expression, which it is, then that may then go into translate into things that are tweaked within the algorithm. So we're not sitting around all day scrutinizing the coding. That's literally not what our function is. But we do have an impact there. So there are some very important caveats on the scope of our work. But I think within the existing scope of the board, there is a lot of stuff we can get on with.
I think it was our wonderful Secretary of State, Nadine Dorries, who apparently asked Microsoft when they were going to stop using algorithms, which I won't ask you to comment on that.
I won't comment on that one.
Just looking into the future, because you did mention Meta and how that will change in the Metaverse, whatever that may end up being. Is that something which you are already thinking about, or do you wait for things to happen before you oversee them?
No, we are thinking about it. I mean, the future of content clearly is skating in the direction of virtual reality and augmented reality content. And TBD, how big an impact this is going to have on all of our lives. There is a lot of hype and noise around this, of course. Lots of people are still trying to define exactly where the metaverse starts. In many ways, I think about the metaverse similar to previous sort of hype cycles within the industry. So there was a while where every single ambitious startup within London wanted to be a big data startup. And then after a while, they deleted the words big data, and now they were all AI startups, and now they're all metaverse startups. But there is clearly something that is real within this, right? The technology, the science has advanced to the point where we can create this feeling of presence within virtual worlds. There are virtual worlds that are emerging now with hundreds of millions or hundreds of thousands or millions of users. And Meta is developing some of those. It's obviously not something that belongs purely to the company. If the metaverse ever achieves a fraction of its vision, it will be built by a lot of different companies beyond just Meta. But it is something we're thinking about. We've started very early conversations with the company, and we basically put our hand up and said, when you come to the point where you are thinking deeply about what the future of content moderation looks like within the metaverse, we want to be a part of that conversation. Board members are certainly looking to get much more educated on those issues. And I think, look, the company just rebranded itself. They've just started focusing a lot more on this. I think this is an area of growth for the next few years.
And then just finally, before we take questions, because there's a number coming in online as well as here, one of the big issues at the moment, which hadn't even started when we talked about planning this, is the invasion in Ukraine,
right.
And what's happening there. The Centre for Combating Digital Hate has been quite critical of Facebook's response. I think their figure is that 91% of Russian propaganda posts haven't been flagged. And these are despite, I think, policy statements that things from state actors would be constrained. Is this something that you've been engaged in, or is this not something which you would wade into?
Yeah, so Ukraine is something the board has been following very closely, and how Meta has been responding to that. We've recognized they have made a number of changes in a fairly rapid time frame on some of those issues, and clearly the company has been trying to protect users. We do expect the board will be taking a closer look at some of those changes, and nothing I can announce today, but I expect this will be a big focus for the board's work. And we know actually that news has already emerged from the company that they plan to refer a number of the changes they've made to the oversight board for us to re-review, in the same way that they sent the Trump suspension over to us. So I think this is an area where we will be wanting to look and see not only how it impacts people within Ukraine and within the region who are impacted by the Russian invasion, but also to think about how do these rule and enforcement changes affect people around the world in very different but also similar situations. Changing the rules for any given context or community also has the potential to impact people in very different situations, right? There are conflicts in other parts of the world that are going on right now. And I think a lot of people, who've been looking at this from a content moderation point of view, they've naturally immediately thought, how do rule changes in Ukraine potentially impact people in Ethiopia? How do things in Ethiopia affect people who are impacted by the conflict in Israel-Palestine? So these are all very, very important questions, and the board will be getting into that.
I'm glad to hear it. We ran an event here about Middle East, North Africa, refugee health and conflict zones, and there were certainly some comments about how come people are looking at Ukraine and haven't looked at Syria in the same way. But
right.
Watch this space, and I look forward to watching that space.
Absolutely.
In the meantime, we do have time for questions. So should we start off with any questions from the audience? So we'll start off with that one up there, and gives me time to read all the ones online.
Hey Dex, thank you very much for this. This is fantastic topic, very relevant to our times. I was curious. You mentioned that the results of the oversight board will be judged by the value it creates, and the speech you're giving is very human rights forward. So it leads me to believe that the approach of the platform would be more towards a deontological point, which would be like conserving the principles of a neutral platform. Would you agree on some sort with that? Sorry, gonna complete it. It seems like it's gonna be impossible to get absolute rights here, and there will forever be a bit of an ups and downs in the platform's views, just because it has this perspective of what is right according to who.
I think, wow, that's a really great question. I'm always incredibly amazed and delighted when I come to Cambridge, because people ask such smart questions. And a lot of the times I'm just answering questions from the media, and they're, it's basically based on whatever's in today's headlines. So this is a great question. This is at the very heart of our work, right? When people think about human rights, and I start talking about how the board is trying to align content policy with human rights standards, their eyes usually glaze over and they're like, oh, sounds kind of boring, sounds like lawyer talk. This is, of course, central to how we think about free and fair discourse in societies around the world. And I don't know the answer fully to your question, so I'll just confess that up front. I do think if we're going to reach a sensible answer to that, it will be much better that a group like the Oversight Board is in a position to come up with the answer rather than Mark Zuckerberg. And I think that allowing companies that have amassed this kind of influence over our lives and over society and have these kind of resources, but have also shown that they are incredibly generally America-centric, I think they've shown that they can't figure out these answers competently on their own. And so I give Meta the credit, as much as I'm grudging to give them credit on anything, because that's not my job. I grudgingly give them credit for actually going about and committing to the Oversight Board as an experiment to try and figure out these questions. I do think, so going to the substance of your question, which is, can we stay neutral, or are there more value judgments that need to be made here? I think for a long time, people thought about neutrality and keeping a neutral platform as being indifferent or apathetic to these issues. And I think all the experience of the last few years has shown us that if platforms are neutral or indifferent to these instances, really, really terrible consequences, emerge for the rest of society. And I actually think there has been a big shift in thinking within Silicon Valley over the last few years. There has been a pivot towards people, prepared to be much more proactive on these issues, and still, of course, not nearly proactive enough for many of the issues we're talking about, and certainly not for a lot of policymakers who are, focusing every day on these things. But we were talking a little bit about Ukraine before, we sat down here tonight, and I was saying actually, although I recognize there are lots of people, and you mentioned one group who are very, very upset with Meta on Ukraine, the company also has tried to move pretty aggressively on making changes to its enforcement in a way that I think previously companies might not have been doing that a few years ago. And now thinking about how do they staff up on capabilities and resources proactively, I think that's a good thing. There's obviously still a very, very long way to go. So that was my unsatisfying way of saying, I have no earthly clue how to answer that, but we're working on it.
Can I just pick up maybe a simpler question, I don't know, from here? Joanna Nula says, is the appeals process sufficiently inclusive and accessible? And in particular, could a 13-year-old child or an elderly person appeal, or do they have to be able to understand technology, work some magic, do whatever it is? I'm paraphrasing.
That's a great question. So I think it's very inclusive. If anyone sees problems with it, literally email me, ping me. I love getting feedback on this stuff. These are things that the board takes really seriously. The website and the appeals process are available in, I believe, 18 languages currently, and we're expanding that. So we cover the very, very vast majority of languages for users on Facebook and Instagram. The appeals form and process is designed to be very, very accessible. So short user statement in your local language. It is something that isn't designed to be an onerous process. The fact that we've had over 1 million appeals, I think, in just the last year, I think speaks to the fact that we are getting things coming in. But certainly there's lots of room for improvement. And if you see anything, please share.
No. Let's take, I'll take the one in the middle, yeah, and then online, and then I'll come to you.
So obviously, thank you very much. My name is Gabit. So obviously you work on removing content or some, but there are lots of, especially nowadays on Facebook, you have all these bots, like fake profiles. So almost people, and it's really hard to tell whether they're real or not. But of course, Facebook has probably means to determine that. So can we as users flag those people if we know for sure that they're bots and serving certain political or even extremist purposes? Can you delete those users?
Yeah, I believe the existing reporting process is designed to allow you to report things like that. And actually in Ukraine, one of the things I know Meta did recently was they took down one of those networks of fake profiles. So there were a whole bunch of profiles that were being run out of Ukraine and Russia by a network of bad actors who were spreading disinformation. And that was reported by a whole bunch of organizations and NGOs who had spotted this. So certainly I think the company relies on users also identifying these things, as well as their own systems and expertise also trying to target these things.
So a question from online from Paul Vansfrey. It says, but basically, isn't the Oversight Board just a bit of a lottery? And the example Paul uses, and I think you may have put this in before we talked about this a bit, I've submitted several appeals concerning goods sold on Facebook ads which are required to conform to product safety legislation but don't. And the platform doesn't consider those ads breach so-called community standards, and efforts to get these matters reviewed by the Oversight Board have never been picked for consideration. How do you recommend that such serious matters can be addressed? And I know you said that adverts were out of scope, but should they be in somebody's scope then if they're not yours?
Potentially. So I obviously can't comment on the specifics of that case, without knowing details either. Certainly we are a small entity and we can't do it all. And, there are thousands of appeals we receive on a monthly basis, which are things that raise important questions. With our limited resources and bandwidth, we are trying to pick up the biggest possible cases there which raise big questions. Now, that does not at all diminish the fact that for an individual user, if your content has been moderated in a way that is wrong, it has a huge, potentially life-changing impact on you. I get lots of messages, and I know board members get lots of messages from people just informally, through my Instagram direct messages or through Twitter. Sometimes people send things by post to our office, and they say, look, my page was taken down and like my whole livelihood depended on this thing, and I can't get in touch with a human at the company. Like, I'm ruined by this thing, like, help. And a lot of the time, because we get so many of these things, the board is not equipped to process all of these things. Now, actually, from the board side, we have set up a channel so that we can send things to the company. So we do actually try to, help direct attention and resources to these things. But in most of these situations, it is up to the company to go and fix these things. The board not being equipped to go and deal with all of these things does not excuse the company or let them off the hook. And I think some of the impact of regulatory changes, over the coming years, in Europe and the UK in particular, are looking at things like how do they better protect users and treat them as consumers. So actually having the ability to get somebody on the phone, the ability to appeal to a human. Right now there's just a lot of people who it seems just fall through the gaps in these systems. But I absolutely share the frustration, right? If you want to go and have your content fairly treated, and there's a body that's been set up as the oversight board, you might think, why can't I get my content seen by them as well? And I think it just reflects the reality of us as being a small part of the solution.
And somewhat related, I'll come to your question in a second. Sebastian Thevu, or it's not showing me the full name, Thevu Chabuel, points out a different group of people who don't seem to be able to get access. So Sebastian says, many shareholders of Meta have tried to engage with the company on human rights related issues. While we can't say they give no access at all to some of their people working on these issues, Meta blocks access to top management or its board. Could it be envisaged to establish a channel of communication between shareholders and the oversight board? So it's a very different group of people, not just consumers or users, but investors.
Yeah, I mean, actually, so we do, from the board side, talk to a lot of very different stakeholders. And, we see the place of the board is to engage as broadly as possible. So one audience that I talk to a lot is Meta advertisers, because it turns out that the businesses who pay money to the company to list their products on there, lots of them have huge concerns about things going on the platform. They don't want to be associated with, cyberbullying and hate speech and all of these things. And so the advertising industry certainly has been, digging into this area for a while, and they talk to us, quite often. Certainly I think, investors are another audience, who should make their voices heard, and, we'll happily talk to them. And I think there's an ecosystem of other actors who would like to hear those voices, because, ultimately changing the company and improving it, that will depend on a lot of different actors, and investors, are one of the biggest, right?
So there was a question up in the front. And then I think there's at least some others there, yeah.
Hello, thank you, very interesting. I'm potentially interested in the range of work that you're doing. You make it sound very simple, and I'm sure it's hugely complex. But some of these recommendations must be sort of quite easily solved and short term, and others must be sort of quite long-term issues with various nuances along the way. Does the board kind of have an ongoing monitoring role in these things to make sure, and those that, is it those longer term, more complex issues which are primarily what will create the future for Facebook?
Yep, that's a great question. And the short answer is we monitor the implementation of all of the recommendations in a very detailed way. So when the company says we agree with those recommendations, we're going to go do them, we're not just going to take that at face value. We're not taking that on faith. We have to assess whether the company actually is implementing these things, and to verify that with the data and with the evidence, and to see how that's actually implementing, within the platforms. And the other thing, of course, is when it comes to implementing these things, because you're right, many of these recommendations can be things that are very complex. There are always potential unintended consequences and side effects for when you tweak systems and rules. And so engaging in this process of studying the implementation, it's very important for us that we don't exacerbate the problems. The board is coming from the perspective, first of all, to do no harm. And there used to be this slogan that was much maligned that Facebook used before it dropped out of fashion because it was so terrible: move fast and break things. And of course, one of the problems with the move fast and break things approach, when you've got 2.9 billion users and you have a massive impact on society, is that that tends to have disproportionately bad impacts within communities when things break. So we, half jokingly, but only half jokingly within the board, think of our motto as move thoughtfully and defend human rights. So as wonkish as you can come up with a slogan, which we don't put on posters or anything like that. But we have a group, it's called the Implementation Working Group, very, very creatively named. And it has a set of members on it and some staff who support it. And we are engaged in the process of dialogue constantly with the company to understand how they are progressing the things that they have committed to. And we also publicly score them on this. So every quarter we put out a transparency report. We put all of our dirty laundry out in public and say, this is how we think the company is doing. We have a very large, very detailed annual report, which will be coming out for the first time in the next couple of months. And that's going to be our first big annual scorecard for how we think they're doing on things, including implementation. So the transparency piece, which we haven't talked about so much, I think is also a very important part of what we do, right? Because we're the body that has a limited role and limited set of resources. One of the things that we can do, which is most impactful, is actually just exposing all of these problems to daylight. Because there's all these other actors I was talking about who are part of the solution. And if they can get knowledge and data about these problems, even if the board can only play a limited part in solving these things, potentially we can empower a lot of other actors to be part of the solution. So researchers, for example, I think have a very critical role to play. Policymakers obviously have a huge part to play in shaping the overall environment and so on.
Just picking up very quickly on that, because you're clear about the fact that your decisions are binding on the company. Just so that I understand this, that individual decisions are binding, but policy recommendations are not binding at all? Is that right?
That's right. So basically, in every case the board takes up, there are two components. There is a decision on a single piece of content. So you might get a case saying, here's a piece of COVID misinformation in France. Facebook has removed this. The user has appealed it. Should you restore it or keep it off the platform? And we'll make a decision on that, and the company has to implement it. So if they've taken it off the platform, they've got to put it back. In those cases, we also issue a set of recommendations, and they're only recommendations, but we'll say, right, because you did that, it's now raised the following issues. You didn't tell this user clearly why you removed their content. You now need to change your rules so that you always tell the user what's the reason their content was removed. They weren't able to read this, part of the community standards in their language. You should translate those into a language they can read. Your rules are confusingly written and they don't contain an exception for satire. Go away and include that in your rules. So we might have a whole bunch of these pieces, and that is then, all the stuff that we then monitor through the implementation working group. The binding decision component, that's done very, very quickly. The recommendations take a bit longer to push through.
And the rather mysteriously named MB, people online can have initials or just be anonymous, but MB points out, this is related to the responses, that the flagging process has already been weaponized by data farms, that there is already people taking advantage of the processes which have been set up to help control content to attack legitimate content. Is this something you're concerned about?
I don't know if they're referring specifically to the Oversight board, because I don't think that's been a big problem with us specifically, but certainly I'm aware of it on Facebook and on Twitter. We've just seen it in the last few days and weeks in Ukraine, right? So you have bad actors who are going around flagging profiles for points of view they don't agree with, in order to try and get journalists, activists, people on the ground having their profiles disabled. And usually platforms, because they are now very aggressively staffing up to deal with Ukraine in particular, they've often been able to reverse these things quite quickly. But of course, there's a huge disruptive effect, right? You're an activist on the ground, you're trying to document, war crimes or atrocities. Your account is now suspended for, half a day. You're sitting, out in a war zone. You're probably not, trying to, do appeals. You're certainly not, writing nice emails to, a public policy official at Twitter saying, please restore my account if you don't mind. Definitely it is a big problem. And the only way to deal with this is for net platforms to be investing the kind of resources necessary to counter this. These are problems that, are going to occur more and more.
We might come back to that thing, but I think there was a question at the front. Do you want to wait for the microphone? Oh.
In terms of transparency, do you publish the decisions, recommendations you make after anonymizing the parties' names? But do you publish them so people can know how you see things so they can comply? Or is it just that the decisions and no one else knows?
Yep, great question. No, we publish everything. And we publish decisions on our website in all of those 18 languages. We provide all of the adjacent information so you can understand what is it the company told us and all of the reasoning. So how did the board reach its decision? Our decisions have been criticized sometimes for being incredibly wonkish. One journalist, who I won't mention, said we are the UN of tech. But as somebody who spent part of my career at the UN, I took that more as a compliment, actually. We'll assume that there's some good there as well. But I think that this is an important part of the transparency, right? Having those decisions in all of their incredible detail made available, I think is essential so that people have trust in the board as an institution, and so that those decisions have the maximum utility for people. And you can see exactly, what we've told the company. Interestingly, the company also has to make all of their responses to the board public as well. So when they say, we're going to go study these 5 recommendations you made, they can't, wander off and then, send us a, 2-line note, a month later and say, actually, we decided not to do that. They have to respond to us publicly and say how they're responding. And if they don't pick up a recommendation, they have to explain why they've chosen not to do it. And that's all documented on a website that Facebook set up, transparency.fb.com, I believe.
Another question just about sustainability and the practical application of this. And I guess, to paraphrase this question again, not just for Facebook Meta. Is this a reasonable answer to the failure of self-regulation of all the big platforms about how decisions are made against a backdrop of absence of standards and benchmarks of good practice? Can a Facebook oversight board or a Twitter oversight board be a response to the DSA's call for independent audits and systematic risk assessment?
That is a great question. I will say how we fit in with the DSA and potential roles that we take on is something that we are studying at the moment. Can't say exactly how we're eyeing that, because this is a live debate, and obviously the DSA is very, very fresh.
Yep.
But definitely, we see a role, and there is clearly a role that European policymakers had in mind for self-regulatory structures. The DSA, DMA was very deliberately written so that it isn't entirely up to policymakers. There is a very large burden of responsibility that has been put on the industry. And certainly there's nothing about the oversight board that is incompatible with what the DSA is doing. I think the question is, to what extent will an independent self-regulatory approach to some of these things become baked in as the norm for the industry? And then, whether it's the oversight board or it's other actors and new institutions that are set up, TBD.
So just to pick up on that, because there's the DSA thread there, but I'd also just like to push you on, particularly because one of our guests to come is Nick Pickles from Twitter. Do you think all the other tech platforms should be doing something like this?
I think all the tech platforms should be committing to some sort of independent oversight. I think independent oversight, exposing the way that the platforms operate to transparency, to a check on the power of those platforms, I think that is an incredibly healthy thing. Whether it's through the oversight board or something else, I think that's a bigger conversation. We don't have any sort of ambition to be the one oversight board to rule them all. I know Twitter has been experimenting and thinking about what their content moderation machinery looks like long term. But yeah, this would be a great question for Nick as well. I'll be tuning into that.
I may well. It's a shame we can't have the two of you to have a conversation. I should probably take a question from over here. Did I see a hand up? Yeah.
Hi. Don't you think that the oversight board should have a public stance and opinion on some of the regulations and laws proposed by the US Congress, some of them pushed forward by some very prestigious NGOs like the Petition to Ban Surveillance Advertising, which they assure that, and they conclude that surveillance advertising business model poses a fundamental threat to civil and human rights, liberal democracy, and public interest. After all the Francis Hogan leaks, don't you think that the board should have an opinion about these laws and regulations and their stance on whether this advertising and business model should continue or not?
Yeah. So I would say definitely there's a lot of board members who I'm sure have very strong opinions, including specifically on that issue. There are others who probably don't have such strong opinions on that piece of legislation, and part of the reason will be they're not focused on the US. We have a very international board. The diversity of the board is, I think, one of our very strong assets. And in many ways, I think part of the challenge here, because I completely share your view that these are huge issues that we need to have a lot of voices engaged on. Part of the challenge, though, is in the content moderation space, a lot of the debates historically, and definitely over the last decade, have been way too dominated just by the United States and Western Europe, and what's going on in Congress, and what's going on in the EU Commission, and what's going on in the UK House of Commons. And as an institution, we don't want to get distracted by that. So it's not actually because the board doesn't have opinions about these things. This board has lots of opinions, but we took a decision very early on that with the limited time and the fact that we are still somewhat of an experiment, instead of focusing on going down the path where we take lots of public stances on things and we become more like an advocacy body, which is valuable, but it's just not our focus. We thought the most valuable thing we can do, because Meta has agreed to it, and they've given us an irrevocable trust, which we're not giving them back their money. We thought we'll go focus on making decisions and studying their policies and where they're broken, and get the company to agree to change. And that's the best value we can create right now. Does not mean at all that you don't need lots of other people to step up. Now, I think the great thing is you have a lot of people who are in that space, right? So you have people like Frances Haugen, you have lots of leaders and activists and organizations who are 100% on top of these issues. I don't think actually we have a shortage of that. And that is one of the things that gives me hope, right? Because a lot of these issues can be, they can be quite depressing. And you think about the range of problems in the world and the range of problems, involving, content moderation and the impacts on different vulnerable communities. I actually think the advocacy organizations, that's where we have some of the strongest voices. So that's my slightly lengthy answer about why we don't do it, but we don't think it's not a valuable thing for others to be doing.
And do you interact with these bodies,
Yes.
or with Frances Haugen, for example?
We met with Frances Haugen twice. The entire board turned out to meet her. She has an incredibly valuable contribution to the debate. And obviously Meta will give you a very different, answer there. We are not Meta. So from our point of view, why would we not talk to her? And we also talked to another former Meta employee, Sophie Zhang, who also had previously, made a number of, information releases and so on, talking about the global impact of some of Meta's policy decisions. So we talk to a lot of people from all communities and political spectrums. We engage very heavily around the world, again, because we don't want to just be listening to that very well-established, very well-oiled advocacy network that is in the US or in Western Europe. And actually, over half of the cases that the board has taken have been from the global south, which I think is, again, an important marker. And every one of those cases has, again, been something that a lot of communities around the world have been engaged on.
So, an interesting question from our own Stephanie Deeperveen. One of the challenges of all of this regulation is that it's often reactive.
Mm-hmm.
You're responding to harms after they've occurred. Appeals can only happen when something has happened, which is going on. What would require for regulation to become more proactive, trying to preempt it? And it actually is self-regulation, like your recommendations, the most proactive approach to addressing harm that we can think of, or are there other ways to get ahead of the game?
Oh, you can take this in so many different directions. The one that I always come back to is, what are the larger societal issues underpinning the problems that we're experiencing on social media? You can talk about misinformation or disinformation in terms of what the platforms ought to do, their algorithmic responses or their policies, failures of enforcement. There's a reason why millions of people in societies around the world are prepared to believe misinformation and are prepared to spread it. And we spend far too little effort as a society addressing that real iceberg sitting under the water of all the societal root causes of these issues. And I do think if you're looking for like a purely tech industry or algorithmic response to societal problems, you are begging to be disappointed. So first of all, I think to be proactive, we need to go and address that iceberg. We need to look at the part under the waterline, not just the tech part that's nice and shiny above the water. I think the other thing is, part of the reason that you don't see more proactive regulation is a lot of policymakers don't really understand these issues. And you're an outlier, Julian. You're somebody who comes from a background as a policymaker who thinks very deeply about these issues, and you've built your life around studying these things in depth now and talking to a lot of smart thinkers on that. Lots of policymakers, this is a side hustle for them. They've got their focus on other things. They're focused on local issues, on constituency issues, getting to grips with the future of the knowledge economy or the intricacies of the DMA. That's not a thing that they're equipped for. And this is where you get the sort of excruciating exchanges that you've seen in things like when big tech CEOs get summoned to Congress or they get summoned to Parliament, and the quality of questioning is just terrible. I think if we want to have a society and we want policy makers and regulators who are genuinely being proactive about the biggest tech challenges, they need to be much more tech literate. It's as simple as that, really. And this is why, I was at an event last week in Washington, and like a lot of conversations, we came to this topic, the metaverse, and how should society be preparing for this? And round the table, I was the only person there who'd actually used virtual reality. I was surrounded by policymakers and a lot of European policymakers, and my mind was just blown because I was surrounded by a lot of policymakers who were working on issues around digital economy and regulation. When you have these platform shifts once in a generation, we had the arrival of smartphones in 2007. It obviously upended society, and decision makers were not prepared at all for the arrival of smartphones and the impact it would have on the way we live and on the way society operates. And you had things, as diverse as issues from the Arab Spring to Uber destroying the taxi industry in cities around the world. Those were both things that were intimately connected with the mobile revolution. You've now got the metaverse, which promises potentially to be the next great platform shift. It's going to have an impact socially, economically, politically, which is potentially far, far greater than the arrival of mobile. The kind of disruptive power of those platforms cannot be underestimated. And I think most policymakers are not taking them seriously at all.
I mean, I wish I thought you were exaggerating about the lack of understanding. I remember the Digital Economy Act in 2010, where the minister kept referring to IP addresses as intellectual property addresses. And you could have a legitimate argument about the policy, but it'd be quite nice to know what the words
Maybe he's
mean.
making a very deliberate, clever point.
I would that were the case. I would that were the case. We have lots more questions here, but I did see one up. I think there's one up there and then here. Yeah.
Thank you. I will have one question. You've been speaking about self-regulatory approaches and regulation in different countries, especially in the EU. Do you see any chance for there being international action, be it independent or, from a technical point of view, like ICANN or some nations coming together?
Yeah. Definitely there has been action in this space, and you've had sort of sporadic things that have driven the agenda in different ways. You have the Christchurch call to action and things like that. When it comes to things like ICANN or the ITU or the UN, I think we have to be very careful about the role of those institutions, because obviously they don't just represent the democratic states. They have very different conceptions of how some of these technologies should be integrated in society and should be managed. And of course, you'll remember probably about a decade ago, there was a huge furor at the idea that the ITU was going to try and take over the internet. And Russia was certainly making a big play about wanting to have a much strengthened ITU, which was consistent with its vision for how things should unfold. I think if they had gone down that path, it would have led to a disastrous set of outcomes. So I think the question is, out of our existing big international institutions, is there a path, is there an institution that is better equipped to create some sort of global framework for action on some of these issues in a way that isn't just immediately politicized and subservient to the interests of one of the great power blocks? I'm not sure the answer to that at the moment. I do think probably because of that, it's going to be regional action that ends up having a much greater impact. So things like what the European Union is doing, I think have a tremendous impact. And the EU legislation, the DMA, the DSA in particular, they also will have an impact around the world. So once people see the impact of these things and they become translated into sort of local norms and situations, they end up being replicated around the world. And this is also why it's both a great opportunity for Europe to be a digital leader. It's also something that we, again, have to be very concerned about, because there's a potential for rules and standards that were designed for one situation to be then applied in very, very different ways for bad ends in other parts of the world. Which is why I always get alarmed when I see very populist proposals for content moderation or digital standards, which are being thrown out for easy headlines in the Daily Telegraph or in the Times, and people have not thought about what does that mean for somebody who's a dissident in another country who's now being given air cover by a UK politician to say, hey, we should go and roll this out in our country.
Just related to that, there's a question here from MB about fact-checking. Now, do you do fact-checking?
Fact-checking is not something that's within the scope of the board. So there is, Meta obviously has a fact-check program, but it isn't something that the board has been able to put within scope. It is something that the board definitely has lots of points of view on. I expect it is something that we have an appetite to take a closer look at. And clearly, there are lots of questions from some communities in particular about how effective the fact-check program has been and how fair it's been.
So, and then I won't ask how much you check the fact-checking, but I will instead go to the question over here.
So is it so? And you depend on Meta on funding, but is it possible do you accept funding from other sources, or should you accept funding from other sources, or in the future would you like to be entirely independent as a board? I know it's a little bit tricky, but
yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we have an explicit answer on that right now. I mean, we are dependent on that funding which was given to us by Meta, and that's where our current resourcing is from. Down the road, I think we could evolve as an institution, and having different sort of economic models may make sense. I will say I think the company will always need to invest resources in this kind of enterprise, if for no other reason than to have a commitment to the institution. And I think the model that we've created, that institutional structure, has shown there is a way that companies can contribute to it without it influencing the decision making. Meta and their PR interests or their regulatory interests or their advertiser interests, that doesn't influence the decisions that the board makes. And I think that actually is something that a lot of people were surprised about, because when the board was created, that certainly would have been a concern, right? Nobody had ever tried something like this, and the power of all of those interests is intense. So it may not be necessary to go and build all those new economic models, but down the road, we'll see.
So just to feed in a question from Sandeep Taylor about oversight boards, because you talked about your concern about some sort of UN-led, governmentally run single body to rule them all. But could a number of tech companies come together to gradually expand a tech oversight board? And could it be in some way democratically accountable rather than just being a Facebook creation or Meta creation?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all really interesting avenues to speculate on, right? And obviously, none of these are proposals in the short term that I think are going to happen. But one of the things that certainly having spent the career in the tech industry, I've always been very focused on is how do you reflect public opinion in decisions? There is a huge amount of concern, rightly, over the influence of the tech industry and on people and communities all around the world. And when people started using this analogy about the oversight board as Facebook's Supreme Court, which I don't use, a lot of people then also expressed frustrations that the board wasn't incredibly responsive to whatever was the story of the day or the story of the week, which was not what we were configured to do. However, it seems to me like there would be a utility in having some sort of body which is accountable and responsive to those sorts of impulses. So actually, the thought experiment I always come back to is, if you have a Supreme Court, where's the Parliament? Like, maybe there's a virtue in having something that is more responsive to public opinion, that has a function that is very different from being the adjudicator on these issues, but actually is something to give voice to communities, and to really show what are the viewpoints that are coming from within these platforms. Because of course, the viewpoints of communities are very lazily invoked by lots of leaders, sort of a hand-wavy way. We believe communities are concerned about X. And I think frequently, just from interacting with so many organizations and leaders, I think actually the opposite is true. We actually don't know what most people think about most issues most of the time. And so I think there's an interesting thought experiment there, certainly, about what could a more representative body look like.
We do some work with YouGov, and so maybe should talk about how we find out what people think in various places. There's a question here which I thought was quite interesting, about all sorts of cases in lots of companies where platforms have arguably failed society, and this idea of a license to operate. In the future, would it be sensible for platforms to be expected to fulfill certain standards before they're allowed to launch a business? Would you welcome some sort of pressures to say, here's the minimum standards?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, companies have to exist within a legal and regulatory framework. When we talk about like the need for regulation, it's not that there aren't regulations. There are obviously lots of regulations that already exist for platforms. So I think the question would be what standards are we talking about? I think it's very much the proof is in the pudding. I think setting unnecessarily onerous standards would not be a good thing. And so the question again would be, are we calling for platforms to have well thought out content moderation infrastructure and well-crafted policies and things that protect users and show that they've done the work to do that? I think that sounds like a very reasonable proposal. I think that's a lot of what the regulatory proposals that like the online safety bill and what's been coming out of Europe have been very much focused on. So I think these are things that are baked in there. But yeah, without knowing more details about it, I'd probably limit myself to that.
I think I have some idea where some of that question's the question. I have a shared interest in edtech and whether, for example, in that area, whether there should be an onus to show that you are doing vaguely competent things before you start working with lots of schools.
There's a very specific topic actually, and it connects to another sort of adjacent topic, which is how platforms treat young people online. Now we're dealing here with audiences, with users who are particularly susceptible to influence, who are more vulnerable. I do think that it is perfectly reasonable to set very strict standards for how platforms should be, looking to protect for users there, and committing to doing things like research and engaging with researchers and opening up that data to scrutiny by researchers.
There's a question right at the front here. I'll try and fit these up. We could go on perhaps all night. So I think that's perhaps a bit unfair on Dex. I think we'll finish shortly. There's at least one more thing I want to put. But
just going back to your point on digital and technical literacy. So I think it's a great thing that you're trying to make much more information about how our content is being managed by Facebook accessible to everyone. But the vast majority of users won't look at those documents that you publish online. And at the end of the day, Facebook has become such an essential tool of life that, do you think it's a bit much to put the responsibility on everyday people to inform themselves about how things really operate?
I think it's an essential requirement that the rules be accessible and that we do have these kind of protections for users, but it's insufficient, obviously. So, another example, obviously when you install an app on your iPhone or your Android, there's a whole bunch of disclaimer text. 99.9% of people never read that. You just scroll and click accept, right? There's a reason for having it though. I think not having the rules laid out clearly, not having that clearly listed somewhere in a format that is legally sound, that would be a loss for society, and we'd clearly experience blowback in a bunch of other ways. If that were the only impact or focus of the board, it would clearly be entirely wrong. It would be a very legalistic focused entity which is focused on achieving these sort of procedural wins. But I don't think that's at all what the board is doing. So we do want to make sure that Meta does make the rules available. People should be able to see what their rights and responsibilities of these platforms are in the languages in which they're using those platforms. But we're also calling for a lot of other changes, and changes to enforcement, changes which have an impact on the algorithm, things which I think really have a deep impact on the user experience. So definitely, I share that concern, and I think that's also partly why I often try to shy away from the purely sort of judicial analogies, because sometimes when people think about that, they think it is something that is going to be purely focused on demanding things like disclaimers and incredibly strict legal sounding text, without thinking about, is this actually ultimately useful and engaging with the biggest issues?
So there was a survey I saw which said, I think I think the figure is 94% of people said they didn't read Facebook's terms and conditions,
Right.
which always suggests to me that almost 6% of people are liars.
Yes, right.
Because I just don't believe the number is anything like that. We'll take one last question from the audience over here, over there. Yeah.
Dex, I'm curious to think with all of your experience and I mean the topics that you cover, you obviously have this experience with technology way different than we do. And I like what you said about the social responsibility on things. What is something you recommend for, like in an educational front for future generations? Like, what is going to be key skills for them to approach this information ecosystem and interact with it?
The number one thing is something that already exists, which you'll probably hear invoked all the time, media literacy. We have an understanding of what it takes to create people who are critical consumers of information in our society. And we don't do it. And when we do it, it's generally an afterthought. It's embarrassing. I went to school in the UK in the 90s. IT classes were, you sort of got 5 minutes to use Microsoft Word and off you go. And I don't think it's changed dramatically since then. This is one of the reasons, for example, I get very frustrated when the response of the tech industry is always to say, we should teach coding in schools. Because yeah, we need more coders. And like if kids want to learn that, fantastic. But not everyone's going to go and become a coder. And I think it will be a huge loss for society if everybody stopped being a coder. And also, we know that existing public schools are struggling to keep core subjects afloat. There's not enough money for things like art or history or English. And all of those are incredibly important too for society. Teaching media literacy in schools so that kids are growing up and they are critical consumers of information, that they understand the challenges of these platforms, so they understand how do you pass through data, how do you understand sources, how should you scrutinize whether something is worthy of deserving your trust online. I think these are all really important things to teach, and we know how to do them, so why don't we do them?
Just before we finish, we were talking earlier about some of the work that Sam Gilbert did about legitimacy. And so he talked here and he's published about an approach to assessing any tech company on their input legitimacy, so how their business model is transparent, their governance, and their output legitimacy, what they do. So he particularly talks about distributional consequences, user empowerment, and controls on abuses. How legitimate do you think Facebook is?
Yeah, this is a topic that June and I were discussing before we started here. It's a company that obviously provides services that create enormous value for billions of people around the world, and I actually think they're coming from a good place. There is obviously a huge cultural disconnect between Silicon Valley and the rest of society, and in particular with policymakers. And if you would listen to a lot of tech critics, you would think that everyone in Silicon Valley was a mustache-twirling villain, and that their goals literally from the outset were to divide people and to take all your money. And actually, there's a lot of people within the tech industry who are very much driven by trying to achieve social impact. So I do think that part of that speaks to the legitimacy there in terms of the inputs. Now, obviously, with platforms that connect billions of people, and with the pace at which these companies have grown and the scale at which they've grown, there have been huge mistakes and there have been huge downsides to connectivity. And one of the sins of Silicon Valley wasn't that they weren't taking these issues seriously enough. It's literally that I don't think they necessarily invested the resources to fully execute on these things. They saw these things were coming, but they assumed that these would be problems that other people would deal with before they realized they were problems that actually you have to deal with as well. I do think when you look at the outputs, that's where the biggest challenges to legitimacy come from, right? It's very, very hard when you see the scale of problems on social media not to think these are deeply systemic problems and the easiest thing to do would be to just burn down the whole structure. And that's where I think you started to get people who are saying, oh, just delete your social media account, or let's all have a digital detox. And I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think most people are doing that. And I think the future of the human race is very much going to be about being connected and using that connectivity for good. But yeah, I would say it's a mixed bag, right? And whether not just Meta, but the rest of the tech industry can overcome those challenges and those challenges to legitimacy, and return people to thinking about the sort of more idealistic, social impact-focused roots of the industry over the next few years? I think that's a big question.
Dex, thank you so much for talking to us for so long. We've covered lots and lots of things, but there's lots more to come. I'm really excited to see how the Oversight Board develops. I mean, I see it as a really interesting, bold experiment, and we will know in a bit whether it's delivered everything it could possibly do or whether there's more learnings to do.
Excellent.
I'm really pleased that you're so involved in it, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us here and online.
Pleasure. Thanks, everyone.